Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Heidi Adkisson. She's the partner and principal UX designer at Blink UX and has been leading complex projects there since Blink's inception in the year 2000. Clients she's worked with include NASA, Amazon AWS, and GE Power Systems. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Heidi Adkisson. Thank you so much, Heidi.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Alrighty. Well, I'm super excited this evening to be talking to you about object modeling for designers. So what I'm going to go through is, first of all, what object modeling is and why it's important. We'll step through how to create an object model. We'll go through some practical real-world scenarios for using the model. And then, as mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A session to wrap up. So a couple of notes, just because people ask me, all the example models you see in the presentation were done using Lucidchart, but I want to emphasize that any diagramming program would work for modeling. So there is a PDF of this presentation that will be available for download. And I mention this because we're going to be looking at a number of diagrams and in a lot of cases just touching on them briefly. And you probably want to have a copy of the presentation so you can reference those later in more detail. And then finally, there is going to be a short exercise that requires downloading a worksheet. So you may have already downloaded that already, but if not, we'll provide a link to that at the time the exercise occurs. So I'm going to start by talking about the roots of object modeling. And we're going to go back to the early 1980s with the advent of the graphical user interface. So what I have here are some early GUI systems, starting on the left here with the Xerox Star system, which came out in 1981. In the middle, we have the Apple Lisa, which is from 1983. And then finally, the Apple Macintosh from 1984, which was really considered the first commercially successful PC with a graphical user interface. But I want to touch for a minute on the system that started it all, the Xerox Star in 1981. So the Star was really representing a significant departure from the way people were interfacing with computers at the time. So the prevailing interface was command line interface, which of course is still around, but is not very easy for regular users to operate. So what's interesting about this image, I got this online, and it is a photo of a Xerox Star monitor. You can see the windows there. And one of the windows is a conference paper that is talking about this new way of organizing an interface around objects and actions. So again, this was a real paradigm shift from the command line approach. And of course, the concept of objects and actions is really embedded in our experiences today. And so here I have a bit more of a modern example where our object here is a sentence, which is highlighted. And then you've got a menu, which is showing contextually here with the available actions, which in this case are some formatting actions. And so if you were wondering what Microsoft was doing back in 1981, that was the year that they released MS-DOS. So MS-DOS was a command line experience and really remained fundamentally command line until Windows 3.0 in 1990. So kind of continuing here with our kind of march through history, in the 1990s, software really begins to proliferate as the PC emerges. And at this point, we get some methods to try to standardize how software was developed. And out of that effort came the Unified Modeling Language, UML, which was a notational system that was designed to represent systems in a consistent way. So as a UX professional, the two most common types of diagrams you might be familiar with is the use case model and the class diagram. So the use case model is a behavioral model. So that is kind of similar in concept to things like user stories. But a class diagram is a structural representation. So this is showing a system's objects and their relationships. So an important tenet in UML is modeling the system from different perspectives, with the two main perspectives being the behavioral and the structural. So where we're going to focus on this evening is on the structural perspective. So here you can see a UML class diagram in more detail. So this is kind of a classic example of an ATM. And so what you have is each of the boxes representing a system object, and then the lines are representing relationships between those objects. And here we're zooming in on an individual object. So this is a savings account object. And you can see in the bottom pane, you have the actions that can be taken against that object. So an account that can be debited or credited. And then you have the attributes, which here would be the account number and the account balance. So in UML, there was a lot of emphasis on designing interfaces using object modeling. So I've pulled a couple of books here from the past. These are actually still available on Amazon. You can buy them used. And they're kind of interesting to see, just to kind of spin through, because I think it provides a great sense of where the discipline was at this point in time. And again, there was a lot of reliance on this traditional UML class diagram, which wouldn't be something most UX designers would encounter today. And I would say that overall, UML has somewhat fallen out of favor, although I do find in my consulting work, developers sometimes do use it, sometimes clandestinely, depending on what their company position on its use is. But as is probably obvious just based on the whole premise of my presentation, I still feel that the tenets of object orientation still have a lot of relevancy for UX design today. So continuing here with our timeline. So in 1991, we've got the development of the World Wide Web. And with the discipline, the field of web design. So web design initially was focused on linking and organizing information. So in the 1990s, you have really two separate but kind of related disciplines. So web design is about creating websites using HTML. And then you have the more mature field of software development. And this would be creating client-based software using traditional software development methods. And I particularly appreciate this divide because in 1997, I took the leap here over from the software development circle here to the web design discipline. And so, of course, now we live in really a completely different world. So software really pervades our lives and takes a variety of different and sometimes overlapping forms. And I would say, just over my time in the field, I've definitely seen people who have started their career in web design, gradually getting more and more into software design. So that's kind of an inverse path from what I had, in that I started my career in traditional software design and then later went into web design. So I want to just talk briefly about why object modeling is still important today. And I've got some ways that you can use object modeling here on this slide. And I'm going to go into these in more detail later in the presentation, but I did want to preview them here. So first of all, the model can help you identify core objects in your system that can drive broader design conventions. You may also want to look at objects with a similar purpose and function and design those together as a unit. And the model, I think, really helps you do that, or at least identify those. The model also helps you find missing or duplicative functions and also inconsistent vocabulary. And then finally, the model can be really helpful in working with a design system, particularly identifying higher level constructs. And I'll talk more about what I mean by higher level constructs, but these would be things, beyond just the individual, very small components such as fields and buttons. But I think a really important factor is that systems without a strong object orientation tend to have low usability. So this is something that I see all the time in my work with clients. And so what I want to show next are some examples of how object orientation helped improve usability. So this first example is a pharmacy app. So this was actually an app that was tested in our labs at Blink, and it did not test very well with users. And so part of the problem here is that for this application, the primary object is a prescription, but it really was nowhere to be found on the initial screen, and overall the experience just wasn't organized around that object. And so here what you have is just a rough concept on the right here that shows how the interface could be rearranged to make it easier for people to discover and perform tasks. So here you can see that we have our objects here on the left. These are prescriptions. And we've got a tight visual association between the object and its associated action. And this is just a rough concept, so obviously in final design, you would be doing some refinement here. But I just wanted to show this as an example of something that is much more strongly object-oriented. So the next example is what I call the digital Winchester house. So if you don't know what the Winchester house is, it's in San Jose, California, and it was built by the very eccentric Winchester widow, eccentric and very wealthy, because she spent many, many years building a house just with no central planning whatsoever, just tacking things on wherever she wanted to. And so what you have is this very large, sprawling structure that is a tourist attraction now. But so my digital Winchester house here is actually an application used by the escrow industry. So this was an old Win32 app that the client came to us to redesign and replatform. And like a lot of large enterprise applications, it had been built over a long period of time, in this case 10 years, with engineers just tacking features on wherever they thought they might fit in the interface. So when I came onto this project, the first thing I wanted to do was understand what was there. So the client arranged for me to meet with subject matter experts in the various areas. And it turned out that some of the functions, nobody really knew what they were or how they worked. So there was just a lot of cruft and legacy in this application. So this was a great opportunity to use some object modeling up front to really understand what's there and what the underlying structures were. So what I did is I started creating this object model. And first of all, don't be daunted by how complex this looks. It was something that was certainly built over time. But the process that we went through is that I modeled the objects and their relationships, working with the subject matter experts until we got a representation of the system that we thought was accurate and represented the breadth of what was there. And what was interesting is that it really turned out the application wasn't nearly as complex as it looked on first glance. So here you can see how we used object modeling to greatly simplify the application structure. So on the left, we have our before, and we went through our object modeling process, and then the final structure and navigational interface there is on the right. So the final example here is a little bit different. So this was a project that Blink did for NASA.gov to re-architect their website. And so I was the lead architect on this project. And like a lot of large organizations, NASA.gov just over the years has really been organized much more by department rather than topic. So what that means is that if you have Department A that has some content about Mars, they will put that content about Mars in their particular departmental section. And then you have Department B who also has something to say about Mars, but they will put that in their little departmental section. And so what you have is just a very sprawling structure with a lot of duplicative and overlapping content. So this was a case where we used object model to model topics. So what the squares here, the rectangles represent in this case are topics, and the lines represent relationships between those topics. And so this was a little bit of a different twist on object modeling, at least for me, because I primarily have used it for application design. But for anybody who has experience with SEO, this probably would look familiar, at least in concept, because it's very close to an SEO entity diagram. In fact, in taking this approach, we really worked with this diagram with our SEO partner, and they fundamentally wound up using that as the basis of their entity mapping. So what I'm going to be describing today is what I call a narrative object model. So this is something that is lighter weight, and I think just much easier for just designers, people without a strong engineering or business analyst background to create. And the main difference is rather than using the UML notation to describe objects and their relationships, the narrative object model uses plain English narrative. So the overall approach with this modeling is just a lot lighter weight and more flexible. So I really think of it as more of a creative process rather than following in the very strict constraints that govern a UML class diagram. So I wanted to just show the idea of the narrative descriptions here in this slide. So this is a detail of the model that I made for the escrow system. And you can see here there's a central object called a transaction. And there's a number of lines here coming into this representing relationships with other objects. So there are some line end treatments here that I'll talk about later. These are indicating different types of relationships. But I want to hold on that for now and just focus on the narrative portion of this. So here we've got property and transaction, And we've got a statement about the relationship between those two objects. So the statement is the property is the subject of the transaction. So we also have, in the loan object here is kind of off screen, but the other kind of object relationship here that's major is that a transaction may have one or more loans. And then we've got the relationship between charges and a transaction. And this is really an example of a more kind of expanded description. So here it says charges are amounts that must be paid by either the seller or buyer in order to close the transaction. So this is, again, just an example of the flexibility I think you have with a narrative approach, in that you can use these kind of expanded descriptions to really tell the structural story of the system. All right, so next I want to go through how you create an object model. And a question I always get is, where does object modeling fit into the design process? So certainly in the consulting work that I do, it's an activity that happens in our discovery phase. So this is an upfront activity before design really begins in earnest. And so typically I am drawing sources for the model from user stories, use cases, sometimes an existing interface. So really what I'm hunting for are clues to how the system fundamentally is structured. And oftentimes the sources are fundamentally task-focused artifacts that are available, or again, particularly with redesign work, I may be working from an existing interface. And we're going to look at doing it from both types of methods. So the steps in creating a model: first, you want to identify the objects. Next, we're going to look at characterizing the relationships between objects. And then finally, identifying objects, actions, and attributes. And so even though I've listed this in a 1, 2, 3 kind of linear fashion, in the real world, it's often much more iterative and emergent in terms of how a model actually comes to fruition. But these are the 3 basic steps, and it does at some level make sense to do them in this rough sequence. So first, let's talk about identifying objects. And a key concept to remember when identifying objects is that objects are simply nouns. So let's start by looking at objects in some user stories. So I have some stories here for an e-commerce system. And an easy way to find objects in user stories is to identify the nouns in the I want to statement. So I've highlighted that here. And so our first user story here, as a shopper, I want to search for products so that I can find products that meet my needs. So the I want to statement here is highlighted. And then I've got the noun here highlighted in yellow. So products would be an object that I could identify here. And you can see I've gone down with the other 2 stories here and just highlighted the other nouns in those I want to statements. And so here we have our starting e-commerce objects from that exercise. So we identified product, cart, and order. So next I want to switch to a different real-world example and look at Twitter and look at the existing interface for Twitter to identify some objects. So things like menus and button bars are really great places to look for nouns, which represent objects in the system. So we're going to take a look at that now. So first of all, I can clearly see there is a noun called tweet. So tweet would be an object that I could identify here. Another noun is account, and in this case, it's represented by the presence of the account name. There's also something called a moment. And finally, there's an icon here to send a direct message. So direct message is another object I can identify here. And so here are the objects we've identified so far for Twitter. So we've got tweet, account, moment, and direct message. So what we're going to do next is a short exercise using the worksheet that I referenced earlier. If you haven't already downloaded that, I think folks are going to put a link to where you can download that now. And what I've done is I've put together some user stories for Slack. And I'd like you to use these stories on the worksheet to identify objects for Slack. So the worksheet has the instructions. I think they're fairly clear. So what I want to do is take about 5 minutes to have folks go through this exercise and identify the objects by looking at these user stories for Slack.
In case anyone didn't see it, there's a link to the worksheet in the chat. Sarah Keats dropped it. You have to copy and paste it. And now there's a linked version. Thanks, Sarah. Heidi, we should have figured out a soundtrack for this 5-minute interview.
I know, you know, and yeah. Music can sometimes be controversial. I've done that in workshops and I've gotten feedback on it.
That's true.
I could try and find something not too controversial.
Heidi, I just noticed that your timer's changing. I want you to show me how you did that in your PowerPoint later.
Okay. Oops.
And as time's winding down, we've just launched a poll. So when you finish, if you can just give us a quick yes to that poll, and then the host will be able to tell where we're at. All right, poll says we're at 92% complete, and you can only vote. I think we're good, Heidi.
Okay, great.
Still needs more time. Just drop us a link.
So
Let's go.
Yeah, so I have up here what the completed worksheet should look like. And so one thing I'll mention here is that in working with user stories, you often find that there's a lot of repetition of nouns, because particularly in Slack, something like a message is a really core object. So that is going to be referenced multiple times. And so the idea with this exercise and approach is really trying to harvest the potential objects by reading through and identifying the nouns and user stories. But then you've got to take it a step further and kind of reconcile that and identify which ones are, you know, your unique objects. So we've done our kind of harvesting here on the worksheet. And then the next step would be to create the reconciled set of objects. So here are the objects that are represented in the worksheet. Now, these aren't all the objects for Slack, the real system. In the interest of time, we've limited the exercise, but this should give you a feel for identifying objects. So next, we're going to get into relationships between objects. And this is really the meat of the modeling. So this is where we're going to be telling that structural story of a system. And we're going to go back to our Twitter example here. And here are some expanded objects here for Twitter. So we identified just a handful initially in the example, and we've got a few more here. And the reason I'm showing these is that I've put them into a model here showing the relationships. So again, this isn't Twitter in its itinerary, in its entirety. It's a simplified version, but it does show the main objects and the relationships and how the narrative can be used to describe the relationships. And so what you'll also notice in this example is these line end treatments, which are characterizing the type of relationship. So relationships are, characterizing the types, I would say, is something that is optional, and that as you start modeling, you may not want to get into that level of analysis. But signifying relationships can be really useful. They can be a helpful analytical exercise, and they can also make it easier to interpret and use the model. So I do want to go through the different types. So there's 4 main relationship types. We're going to go through association, aggregation, component, and inheritance. So the simplest type of relationship is an association, and it's helpful to think of this as the default relationship. So there's no line end treatment here, and it's just showing the simplest type of relationship. So here we've got an account and a tweet, and our description here is that an account publishes a tweet. So that's our narrative describing the relationship. So an aggregation relationship indicates an object that is a collection or list of other objects. So for example, in Twitter, users can add tweets to a curation collection called a moment. So a moment is essentially a kind of container for tweets. And so the aggregate relationship is indicated by the open diamond. A component relationship is a type of dependency relationship where one object is component of another. So in our example here, hashtag is an important component of a tweet, and the concept of hashtag is completely dependent on the idea of tweet. So if you remove the concept of tweet from the system, the concept of hashtag necessarily goes away. So this relationship is indicated by the filled in diamond. And you can see here in our narrative approach, we also have the verbal description here of the relationship. And again, this is an example of how you can use a slightly expanded description to really tell that structural story. And then finally, we have the inheritance relationship. So this is just your basic parent-child relationship. And again, kind of extending a bit on our Twitter example, if you imagine that you modeled the whole thing out to include every kind of both external and internal function, that you would probably have 2 different types of accounts. So you'd have a user account, which is somebody that is an end user of Twitter that would have, but then there also may be administrators at Twitter that have back-end access and have a different type of account. So they're going to share some characteristics, for example, probably name and password, but they may also have unique characteristics. And so using inheritance is just a handy way to notate that. So the key thing with modeling relationships is that there really is no single one right answer or one single perfect 100% correct model. And I certainly see this in the workshops that I do, the kind of half-day time we spend actually creating models, that different groups of people can model the same system slightly differently, but they're both valid ways to look at it. So the goal, again, is just to tell that structural story of the system in a meaningful way, and in a way that's meaningful for your purpose. So here is the object relationship model here for Slack. So when I do a full workshop, participants actually work on creating the relationships for the Slack objects. We don't have time for that this evening, but again, I encourage you to download the presentation and take a look at these relationships. I think Slack is a great example just because it is relatively simple, and I think it's a system that most folks are familiar with. And so again, this is a slightly simplified example, but I think it can help illuminate how you can use relationships, and particularly the narrative description of those relationships. So next we're going to talk about actions and attributes. So this is really filling out your individual objects here. And so here we have an object called prescription. And in the center pane, we've got the attributes associated with that object. So these are things like the date the prescription was issued, brand name, generic name, RX number. These are all things that you might find as data fields in the interface. The bottom pane are the actions. So these are actions that can be taken against the object. And the one thing I will note here, this is just a stylistic preference on my part. I do use functional notation. So the actions, again, I think using functional notation, at least for me, is just a way to make them a little bit more visually distinguished when you are actually looking at the model. So just as we thought about objects as nouns, we're going to think of actions as verbs. So if we go back to our e-commerce user stories here, we can again focus in on the I want to statements, but this time we're looking for the verbs. So our first I want to statement, I want to search for products. We can highlight search as the verb in that statement. And you can see I've identified the other verbs here in these other user stories. And so here are our e-commerce objects with some initial actions in them. And we can also use an existing interface to identify actions in the same way we were identifying objects. So here, though, we're looking for verbs. So I highlighted some verbs either that are explicit in the menu or implied by the icon. And then I just pulled an example of a tweet with a fuller set of actions. So not all the actions are represented on this particular screen capture, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what a fuller set of actions would look like in this case. And then finally, let's touch on attributes. So staying here with our Twitter example. So attributes are really what characterize each instance of an object. So the idea of instance is an important thing to understand with object modeling, because what you're doing with the object is really defining what the object is in its kind of abstract sense. And then what you have from a practical system and UX standpoint are instances of those objects. And it's the attributes that really define the instances of the object. So here we have some individual tweets that are example instances. So we've got one from Kim Goodwin here, one from Seattle Opera, and one from the National Hurricane Center. And so here is a fuller model for Twitter. So this is showing the objects with the attributes and the relationships. And obviously this isn't Twitter in its itinerary, in its entirety. I need to work on that word. It doesn't represent every function in the system, but it does represent the main objects. And I'm going to be talking about the color coding here in a minute, but that's another way that you can really make the object model more useful and usable for your purposes. which is what we're going to talk about next. So using an object model. And an important thing to remember is the object model is really a complement to other artifacts you may be more familiar with. So things like storyboards, journey maps, user stories, those are all looking at the experience from the task perspective. And what we're doing with the object model is taking the structural perspective. So I showed this slide earlier in the presentation, and now I want to dive into each of these areas and talk more about them. So first of all, in doing a model, it can really help you identify a system's core objects. And then you can think of those objects, those core objects, as reflecting a system's unique value proposition or otherwise things that are just central to the experience. And I really like the work that Emmett Conley has done around this. Just thinking about building your design system around these core objects to really help differentiate your brand or organization. And he has a great article called The Full Stack Design System where he talks about this. And so here we have our Twitter model, and I've identified a couple of core objects, and these are using the Boulder outline here. But I've got tweet and I've got timeline here as my core objects. So if I were putting together a design system for Twitter or just designing in general for Twitter, I would think about starting with these objects, thinking about designing them in a distinctive way, creating some unique characteristics for them, and then thinking about how those unique characteristics might be carried through to the secondary objects. So next, it can be really helpful to design objects with a similar purpose and function together as a unit. So back here with our Twitter model, one kind of piece of low-hanging fruit with a model in terms of looking at objects with a similar function is to look for the aggregate objects. So aggregate objects tend to function in the same way in that they are inherently lists or groups of items. And so they have some very similar functional requirements. So it's not to say that you're going to design these all in an identical way, but by looking at them all together and the requirements for them all together, you can think about what sorts of things functionally they might share and how they could be similar and where they may need to differ. And so the advantage of doing this is that it also helps prevent any, or at least minimize some refactoring downstream. So if, for example, you were to first design the timeline and then maybe go and design the moment, and then as you're designing the moment, you realize that it has some slightly different needs and what you did for timeline doesn't really carry across very well, and now you want to go back and kind of reconsider what you did for timeline to make them more coordinated. It just, by looking at them as a unit, it just helps prevent some of that back and forth and potential refactoring. So the other viewpoint you can take with the model is looking for objects that have a similar purpose. And this is where I use color coding. So here I'm using blue in the Twitter model to indicate what I'm calling core content, so kind of the core experience. The green objects all relate to tweet categorization and discovery. And then the orange is more kind of account management related objects. So again, because these kind of have a similar purpose, it can be really helpful to think about designing them as a unit so that they kind of work together in a more cohesive and consistent way. So another question you can ask when looking at the model is, what's missing? Are there objects that aren't functionally complete? So this is particularly helpful if you're doing designing from the ground up, but even in existing systems, you can sometimes find gaps. So we're going to stick with our Twitter example here. And so Twitter famously doesn't allow people to edit a tweet. But if I were working on a client engagement and I modeled this and saw there was no edit function, it would be certainly a question I would want to ask, whether that was intentional, and would want to understand the thinking behind it. So the other thing you can do is look at similar objects and kind of compare them and see if there are functions that they should share that maybe they don't currently. So here we have a case where a tweet can be favorited, but a direct message cannot. So a question you might ask is, should you be able to favorite a direct message? The model is also really handy for working out system vocabulary. So either cleaning it up on an existing system or creating a system vocabulary from scratch with a new system. So again, you can check terms across objects. So here we have a function that conceptually is pretty similar. So we've got tweet and send. And so a question you could ask here, these are very similar concepts. Should they be labeled the same? So I think in this example, we could certainly say that the tweet is kind of a unique thing and it warrants a unique label. But again, this is just an example of the kind of analysis you can do. But also checking terms within objects to make sure that the object just kind of holds all together from a terminology standpoint. So interestingly with Twitter, tweet is both a noun and a verb. So if I was looking at this might be a question I would ask. Although again, I think we can say that for Twitter specifically, the usage here makes sense. So next, I want to talk about identifying higher level constructs for your design system. And in talking about higher level constructs, I want to reference the atomic design model by Brad Frost. So how he breaks down design systems is really using this kind of organic metaphor where atoms are the very smallest components. So maybe like a data field, molecules would be collections of atoms, and then molecules obviously roll up to organisms. And then his metaphor here falls off a little bit with templates and pages. But in my experience, this concept of organism is kind of a important construct to think about with a design system, and it's often a construct that doesn't get enough attention. So I feel like oftentimes design systems, at least in clients that I work with, they're very strong at the atomic level with the atoms and sometimes the molecules, and sometimes they have page templates, but this intermediate space is where the system can sometimes be weak and fall down. And so what that means is that sometimes people put together components in a way that isn't exactly as intended, or really is being implemented in an inconsistent way. So I really think a model is great for helping you identify what sort of things make sense as higher level constructs in a design system. And so here I've referred back to the model that I did for the escrow system. And you can see we were able to identify some organism level kinds of things here as appropriate for their design system. So these definitely were not page level constructs because these were all pieces and parts that appeared in different screens, but they were absolutely things that were important components of the experience and needed to be treated in a very consistent manner. All right. So I've kind of gone through this checklist of things you can kind of do with an object model, but there's also some generalized benefits of modeling. And the first is that it abstracts an existing system from the current design solution. So I find this really helpful in redesign work because when you look at an existing system and how it's constructed, it can be easy to have your design thinking influenced by what's being done now. And I feel like going through the analytical process of modeling it from a structural perspective is very helpful in just stepping back and trying to take a fresh perspective. But if you're doing greenfield design, I think it has some real benefits in providing a compact visual representation of the system. So even though the object model can sometimes be, depending on the sophistication of the client or just the analytical nature of the client, sometimes I will not show an object model to a client, but where I feel like it's a good fit for the client, they often find it really helpful in being able to see kind of at a glance the pieces and parts that are contained in the system. And then finally, it can really help make sense of complex systems that have grown organically over time. And the two examples I showed there were the digital Winchester House, the escrow system, and NASA.gov. So I've got some tips for creating a model. So first of all, start with the easy and obvious stuff. So start with the main objects, the things that are very apparent. And for larger systems, it may make sense to create several smaller models and then bring them together. So particularly if a system is kind of modular, you might kind of work on the task management portion of it over here, the workflow management, and the more transactional part of it over here, and then bring them together. I really suggest building the model out over time in a series of shorter work sessions. I find that it's just better to model for a while, step back, give it some time, and then go back and look at it again with fresh eyes and just kind of gradually build it over time. And then finally, do just enough to serve your purpose. So, I love doing analytical work, and I can certainly have the impulse to kind of create the ultimate model. Certainly as a consultant, I have time pressure with scope of projects, so that helps me be disciplined. But the purpose here is really to model the system to the extent you really need to. And different situations don't require necessarily as much modeling as others. So I recently worked on a project that was more about onboarding for kind of an enterprise system, and very light object modeling in that. There just weren't that many objects. It was much more about kind of doing flow in that case. So there was less modeling involved there. And again, I've mentioned this a couple of times. Two people may model a system, the same system differently, and that's perfectly fine. So I really encourage you to give object modeling a try, to think of it as another tool in your toolkit as a designer, and to get practice, start by modeling a system that is very familiar to you. So that might be something you're close to working with now, or it may be something that just isn't related to your profession, but is a system that you're interested in or use a lot and would like to try to model. So I do have more details about object modeling in the article that I wrote on Medium. So there is a link to that. And I also encourage you to look at some other resources on object modeling. So Sophia Prater in particular has done quite a bit of nice work in object-oriented UX. Her approach is a little bit different. She comes more from a kind of web design background, but I think her work is really interesting and well done. And then there's a great article here just by Everly Yankee on the two different perspectives I've talked about, that object focus or structural focus perspective versus task focused. So thank you very much for your attention. And I think now we're going to open it up for the Q&A portion.
Yes, thank you so much, Heidi. I'm gonna read a few questions here, and then we're actually gonna try something new and invite folks to directly ask their questions to you. So
Okay.
our first one is from Justin Cox.
Okay.
And he says, if we're working through the design thinking process, at which stage do you use object modeling? Is it in define, when you're stating user needs and problems? Is it during prototyping, or where does it fall in?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I think I showed, I'm normally working with some sort of task-focused artifacts. So there would be some level of requirements definition done. And so that may be done in things like user stories or use cases, or as I mentioned, an existing interface. So it's not something that if you're starting, you know, from absolute ground zero on a system, you would certainly need to have some task-focused artifacts, you know, to work from, to understand what sorts of things the system needs to do. And then I think you can start modeling it from the structural perspective. So I hope that answers that question.
Great. And next we're gonna invite Alicia Gianval to unmute and ask her question.
Okay.
Hi, Heidi. So we actually had a pretty hot debate inside of the chat about whether a retweet and like a comment on a tweet would be considered just like it would just be considered a tweet object, or whether it would be considered something that inherits from the actual tweet object. Because we're talking about like how maybe there'd be different properties depending on whether it's a retweet or comment.
Yeah, and so I would, so that's a great question. It's one I actually hadn't thought about, but just off the top, I would think you would probably want to model a retweet as, you know, with an inheritance relationship up to tweet, because I think they share many, many characteristics. But again, as you mentioned, there would probably be some unique characteristics associated with a retweet.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we heard that a lot as a refrain throughout your presentation, that you know, modeling is about a point of view and a perspective. And I remember when we did this exercise in preparation for Convey UX, we were doing Slack at the time, and there were 8 people in the room and 6 different models.
Yeah.
The next question that I see, there's a bunch, but let's go to Michelle Geller.
Oh, thanks, Brent, and thanks, Heidi. My question sort of got answered in the chat. It was about whether the direct message object could also be an action as well. But I believe from your slide on tweet object and tweet with the 2 parentheses as a function,
Yeah.
I would believe that the same would apply to direct message.
Yeah, so the way I have this modeled is direct message is an object, and then there's actions that are related to that object. But you could certainly say, and so I want to make sure so are we talking Twitter or Slack? I'm sorry, because they're both messaging platforms.
Oh, sorry, I was talking about Twitter.
Okay, so Twitter, yeah. So in that case, I feel like a direct message, you know, that might be something I would tend not to model that as inheriting from a tweet, just because conceptually they're kind of different. But you could model it that way. So I don't know if that was your question or if I answered it appropriately or if I wandered off.
I believe that answered my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, you arrived in the same place as someone named Tom Dayton, who looks like he's maybe authored some stuff on this topic. He had really prolific contributor to the chat tonight, and he arrived in a similar place that it would be an object.
Yeah.
Let's see, we've got one from Topher Merritt.
Hello. So a few slides back, you were talking about the atomic design sort of area, and you talked about how it breaks down in some of the intermediate areas. Is there what causes that?
Well, I think organizations find it easy to get spun up with a design system with those smaller components because there's a lot of good starting points for it. So what I see with clients is a lot of them are using material design as a basis. And so then it's a problem really of resources. It's like, okay, who's going to really spend the time to define those higher level constructs and get them into the system and maintain them? So that's just been my experience with a number of organizations I've worked with. I've certainly seen more mature design systems as well, but it is something that I think can get short shrift when thinking about a design system and putting it together. And I certainly see cases where I'm looking at the client's design system and I'm seeing the actual manifestation of the design system, and there's some unintended stuff that's going on there. And I think that kind of mid-range, the organism construct is very useful to think about.
What would you consider that intermediate? What's an intermediate thing?
Okay, so let me spin back here. So I think this, and obviously this is kind of a specialized domain because I'm talking about escrow here, but this is some examples of what I would consider to be kind of organism level constructs that you could have in a design system. So something like a property is a chunk, it's an object that appears in many, many different contexts throughout the system. And so just having a property object in your design system means that when you go to design a screen with a property element in it, it's getting designed in a consistent way. So in this system in particular, property had about four or five different design variations across it in terms of how it was presented. So we were really trying to true all that kind of variation up.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome, and I know that this is sort of a bit of an eye chart at this resolution. So
yeah,
if you didn't see it in the chat earlier, Sarah Keats from Blink will be sending out a link to the worksheet and the full presentation in the next day or two. We've got just a couple more questions. Let me skip back up. I skipped Florencia Hassan. Something about a hashtag.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, by the way. This was a really awesome presentation, and thank you for putting it on. I think you did end up actually answering my question. I don't remember what it said exactly, but it had to do with hashtags being, if you have the question in front of you, Brent, I would really appreciate you.
Yeah, sure. I was just sort of scouring real quick. It says, I don't use Twitter, but couldn't you argue that a hashtag is also an aggregate? Yeah, so,
sorry, I'll let you answer it, but I think you ended up saying that you can actually, they overlap sometimes. And yeah, I don't know if that.
Yeah, and right. So, yeah, and so the way this is, and actually I've got, I don't know how visible this is. I'll see if I can find well, I'll just leave this here. So the way I have the relationship described here, so I've got tweet here and I've got hashtag. I say optionally, tweets can have one or more hashtags which helps users to discover tweets on a particular topic. So I think what might be, you know, I didn't get into the kind of, you know, one-to-one, one-to-many relationship that objects can have, but typically you wouldn't have, like hashtags in and of themselves aren't, like you wouldn't go to a hashtag page. I mean, maybe there is a hashtag page somewhere, but at least in this assumption, I'm not thinking of hashtags as kind of a big list of things that a user would experience, compared to, you know, a timeline is clearly a collection of tweets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the slide even before that example, of course I can't remember it right now, but I think it was even more of a question to me as to how you would end up categorizing it. But I think I did something similar. I did a UX bootcamp, and I did something similar where it was what you see, what the user sees versus and the actions that they end up taking from what they see. And I think this, what you've shown us today, takes it one step further, which is really cool. And I mean, even as far as like information architecture, and even talking about how you find similarities in lists and how you can use that to design something visually similarly. So it really goes deep into it. So I think it was really amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brett, you're muted.
That's awesome. So I have two more questions. The next one is from Christina Rudolph, and then let me see who's next after that. Laura Wade after that.
Oh, you wanted me to talk? I thought I thought you were going to talk on my behalf.
I can if you'd prefer.
Well, I'm talking now. All right. Sorry, everybody. It's like 10:20 here, and I've been up since 4, so my brain is fried. Yeah, can you put up the slide that had the relationships?
Yeah, let me find it.
And then I was just wondering, like, if you could go through the attributes instances on the worksheet. That was it. I have really basic questions because my brain's fried.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure what did you have a question on the relationships, or was there something else you wanted to ask me about?
No, I just wanted to look at the slide.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. And again, you know, the relationship types, I think it's definitely a more advanced concept. So to begin with, you know, I often have folks just start by just drawing the lines and describing the relationships verbally, and then kind of layering on the types and the end treatments later.
Yeah, and the second part, the attributes and the entities from the sheet. If you could put that slide up with the sheet.
This slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is actually showing the objects here. So I'm not showing attributes here.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Right, and then Laura Wade had a question about the sort of the syntax, Heidi. You know, the parentheses in the action area.
Yeah.
And sort of what's the origin of that?
Yeah, I mean, if one was a programmer and you were really filling this out, you would put the method that you eventually develop, the name of the method, in the parentheses. And, you know, so obviously I'm not doing that, but a lot of models are done before the programming is done and before the methods are defined. And so you see a lot of object models just with the name of the action or method is the, technically the correct term in the parens. So it's just a stylistic preference, and it's a carryover from UML notation. And again, it just at a glance, it helps me see the actions more quickly in more complex models.
Yeah, I'll second that as someone who made a lot of these kind of diagrams 20 years ago. When you introduced this concept, it'd been a long time since I had seen a class diagram. Yeah. And the parentheses definitely helped me understand that those were different than the items above. So I think, especially in a dense diagram, really helpful. Patricia, Patricia D. You had a question about limitations of the methods?
Yes, and I know my last name is hard to say, but I was just wondering, have you ever experienced limitations with this method in your work?
Well, I would say, so that's kind of a hard question for me to ask or answer. I would say that I'm not sure I find limitations in the method. I think it's not always 100% useful to take the model all the way through, depending on what particular design task I have in front of me from a project standpoint. So, and I kind of alluded to this, that I don't always fully flesh out a model for every project I work on as a consultant. I often just ask the question, what modeling makes sense here? And sometimes I do very lightweight, just very quickly, just sketching something out with objects and some basic relationships. Other times, like I said, with the escrow system, we really took that model. I wouldn't say it was 100% complete, but it was very close and had all the main functions that we needed to represent in the interface. So I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question, or.
If anything, I just put it into a setting that I can imagine myself using this model in, so that helped with that.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's extensible, right? Like sometimes you go really deep and sometimes so deep.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Great. And then our last question from Alicia. Giovanni, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I just had a follow-up question. So when you were showing the slide with the different types of relationships again, I was curious, do you typically find that those 4 types of relationships are sufficient, or do you end up sometimes generating different notations for different types of projects?
Yeah, so the relationships, the types of relationships are really straight from class diagramming. And so there may be other ones. These are the ones that I learned back in the day. And any sort of additional explanation or context around a relationship, I lean into the narrative. So, and that's something I do want to emphasize, is that particularly because I do consulting work and I'm always faced with systems that initially are not familiar to me, that for me, having to articulate the relationships is a way that I internalize the system. And so I find that in and of itself is a really useful analytical exercise. But the whole idea here of using the narrative, I think this is the really key part of the narrative object model, and it's really what differentiates it from a traditional UML class diagram.
And do you, follow up to that question was kind of based on what you were just talking about with trying to understand these unfamiliar systems, do you typically end up having this be on a cross-functional team, where you're working with people across different disciplines within the company that you're consulting with to understand, because sometimes software engineers might have a different perspective than other designers?
Yeah, so in our discovery phase, we interview stakeholders, and those stakeholders range from project stakeholders to subject matter experts in the domain to people I call customer proxies who have very close customer contact. So that is an important part of me understanding the domain and the system that we've been hired to work with.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Excellent. We are at 7:30 p.m. on the dot. So thank you again to Heidi, to our sponsors at Blink UX and ITCO Solutions, and of course to each and every one of you for attending. We are going to do a 5-minute restroom break. So do what you got to do, grab a drink, grab some food. If you have to go, then thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time. And afterwards, we'll reconvene at this separate Zoom link that I just posted in the chat. So if you want to do networking and breakout rooms, come join us at the Zoom link in the chat. Thanks so much again, everyone.